housekeeping items there, Colin. So delighted to be joining all of you and Karen to discuss this topic. So just in terms of how we'll spend the time together, Karen and I have organized the agenda in three parts. First, we'll spend a little bit of time contextualizing the challenge, looking at market drivers and trends that are impacting the corporate legal function in this area. We're not going to spend a lot of time admiring the problem, but we do want to frame up what the circumstances are and pull in some recent industry research on the topic, including EY's own 2021 Global Law Department survey. From there, we will go into strategies and tactical examples of how we're seeing legal departments address the challenge of internal work allocation and really getting kind of highest and best use from the investment in the department's talent. We will leave time for Q&A, but we're also happy if people have burning questions as we're going through or points they would like to put in the chat. Please feel free to do so, and Karen and I will do our best to field them throughout the presentation. So first, just looking at some of the macro trends that are impacting corporations and driving sort of transformation and innovation efforts. Lots of familiar themes here, I think, for this audience, all pointing to the general need to do more with the same or less constrained resources, all while trying to demonstrate, do a better job of demonstrating business value. We'll be talking a lot today about the second column. This is workforce. This is the people, people and workforce implications, resource, sort of general resourcing strategy. The broader context obviously includes diversifying work streams that are coming into that corporations are having to deal with as a result of global regulatory, legislative change, rapidly evolving business strategies, digital transformation that is affecting every area of an enterprise, not just the legal function, the evolution of service delivery models, increased automation, and all of this necessitating more process standardization, more robust and dynamic knowledge management capabilities, again, across the enterprise, and systems alignment that can deliver kind of consistent, structured, actionable data that can be used to make informed and risk-balanced decisions. A few other data points from a recent CEO survey indicates that the C-suite is pretty intently focused on kind of three things. One is always enabling the business, and this remains true even for companies that are not anticipating that they're going to grow in fiscal 21 or 22, but GCs are still preparing themselves to deal with new product development, new market entry, M&A activity, and so business enablement is still very much front and center. Transforming risk management is another area that has very keen focus, and CEOs expect to have a data-driven approach to making those decisions, and about half intend to launch some sort of cost-cutting measure over the next 12 months. So that's always going to translate into the legal department context, where we have seen about 90% of GCs intend to try to lower the overall cost of the function over the next 3 years, somewhere on the order of 15 to 20%, depending on the size of the company. So, how does this translate into really how it affects the people in the legal department? I think it sort of adds up to a difficult but not unfamiliar picture for practitioners and for legal operations professionals. Because in order to deliver on those CEO objectives, you really have got to be able to focus your people on, your most experienced people on the most critical, impactful work that is facing the company at any given point in time. And all while keeping the trains running, obviously, on the BAU work. So when you look at the human component of this on your talent, do your people have the skills that they need to be successful today? Do they have the requisite enablement? Do they have the opportunity through professional development to be prepared for the future? Do you have succession planning and other frameworks that are in place so that you've got the law department that you need not just today, but 5 or 10 years from now? Are you making the right trade-offs in terms of what work is going outside of your department versus what you are handling inside? Setting aside the company work, where you're always going to have law firm partners to assist you with those sorts of things. Really breaking down legal process work or figuring out what can be sort of disaggregated even within a work stream, and then triaged effectively among your internal resources according to seniority and experience. These are all the things that we're grappling with, and that's really the topic for today: is how do you create sort of the best experience, right, for the people who are doing this work. As always, this criticality of alignment with the business to really understand on an ongoing basis what is highest priority, so that the department can effectively align itself and prioritize the kinds of work streams that are coming into it. So you may, in a workshop setting, which Karen's going to talk about in a little bit, drive those kinds of conversations around business alignment, but it's really important to do that on a regular cadence, so those things are quite clear to everyone. So just a quick snapshot of the trend for in-house. This may not be new data for some of you, but the clear growth trajectory over the last decade reflects a very intentional strategy that has been pursued by general counsel since the financial crisis, maybe leveling off a little bit. But again, that's been the result of a very intentional strategy. I think it's been, the data seems to indicate that it's been effective in terms of cost containment, though it has presented some new challenges around process, maybe technology, but also opportunities, we would argue, right? Now you've got this big, much larger department. How do you manage this bigger group? How do you keep people happy and engaged? How do you keep them wanting to advance within your department and not, move to the company on the street, particularly with the talent market being as hot as it is right now, with people, frankly, having a lot of options. And I think that the scale of the departments now also provide the opportunity for departments to really think through who do they need and what kinds of skill sets do they need. You may have a lot of lawyers, but there may be an opportunity for more technologists, data scientists, people with different skill sets who can help tackle some of those sort of macro challenges that we discussed, that I've touched on earlier. And just one more set of data. When I look at these statistics that just came out of our recent survey, I am reminded of a mantra that one of the general counsel from a Fortune 50 company I've worked with for a long time would always say to me, is that his most valuable asset is 1 hour of an experienced in-house lawyer's time. And so the statistics about beyond just growing workloads in general, lots of different things coming at the legal department, seeing that statistic about how much is perceived to be lower value, that is not to say unimportant, but not that highest strategy work that is going to drive those sorts of outcomes that the C-suite expects, along with the morale impact. Those seem quite alarming, right, to those of us who work in this kind of space every day. But it is, I think, really, departments are going to face increased attrition risk, right, if this is something they can't. There's just a real imperative, I think, to right size the work here. Again, given the sort of the talent environment, so too much work, too much of the wrong work, inability to get access to the kinds of work that is going to really advance their career and help them see where they can be, in a few years, is really important. And triaging legal work is nothing new to a legal department, but I think the confluence of all of these factors and then adding in the sort of virtual and semi-virtual environment that we're all operating in today make it really important for departments to have an operating model that is going to support agility, and increased intentionality around legal team resource deployment over the next several years. So just a quick look at the strategies that we often see deployed on the transformation path. We hear clients say a lot that the strategies on those first two columns are kind of the squeeze play. Not to say that they're not important, not to say that you don't do them. You certainly need ongoing processes for outside counsel management, evaluating what work belongs in-house, negotiating your rates, setting your policy, tracking adherence, figuring out what kind of work may belong in-house, diversifying your resource stack, perhaps bringing in more junior lawyers or paralegals or contract negotiators, technologists, legal operations, et cetera. You need to do all of those things, but there is a point of diminishing return in terms of the impact, transformative impact that those strategies can have. So we think, the industry recognizes this, and we're probably roughly right at the digitization stage where people realize that the real opportunity to transform is around tech process and sort of reevaluating literally how the work is getting done. And I think there's a real opportunity here. As I mentioned, digital transformation is hitting every area of an enterprise. It is not just legal. So legal, I think, has the opportunity to harness that energy that exists on the business side. There's real business demand, demanding visibility into legal work and how it's getting done that will help you build a business case for investment in those transformative technologies and processes. So essentially, what's going to get you to the future is not going to be what has had some impact in the past. So with that, I am going to hand it to Karen, who is going to get into how we are seeing departments tackle this challenge. Karen?
Okay, great. Thanks, Heather, and thanks to the audience for your time today. So what I wanted to do on the next couple of slides is present to you a few usable frameworks that can help you and your colleagues zoom out and really take stock of the work that your department is undertaking with its current resourcing model, and start to think through work allocation at a high level. So like well before diving into data and metrics around utilization, spend, and industry benchmarks for team size and the likes of that. So what we typically do in our conversations with our clients as we start to address this topic of work allocation is we oftentimes start with an illustrative example like you're seeing here of the work that any legal department typically undertakes or oversees. And so this is really a view of the processes that is a level below the individual practice areas or areas of specialization within the department. And those processes, so whether that's things like e-discovery, e-billing, privacy, they're all depicted on a continuum of complexity. And that really just helps to kickstart conversations about what is relevant to your legal department and what are the types of resources that are currently aligned to your key processes. And another thing to just kind of point out is that when you start to break down the view in this way, remove the practice area overlay, if you will, you'll start to see that there's definitely some processes that span different practice areas. And that in and of itself can help to spur conversation and ideas with respect to resource pooling that perhaps you haven't considered before. And just to kind of look at the top of the slide and to draw your attention there for just a moment, you'll see that we've also offered just a very loose categorization of all these different types of processes and work routines, and that is process support, transaction support, and strategic advisory. And below that, we've also offered up just a very loose alignment to the types of resources or providers that we typically see or that we feel like you can start to look to form the basis of your sourcing and work allocation strategy at its highest level, right? And so I'm going to, like on the next slide, I'll talk in a bit more detail about some of these provider or sourcing options. But I thought, maybe before doing that, I would quickly define some acronyms that were thrown up on the last slide. And so the first one is COE. And I think that one is probably universally understood to represent a center of excellence. But I did want to call that out. And also just acknowledge that in practice, there are many forms and flavors of a COE. They can be best practices leaning, if you will, or they can be more operational leaning. But the reason why I wanted to call that out is that, it is yet another resource pool that you can start to consider as you start to think through your strategy for work allocation. And very similarly, GBS, that acronym, we've included that to represent global business services, but you can kind of think of that as any kind of shared service function that might exist either within your department or even in your organization more broadly. So as we turn to the next slide, we've kind of laid out in a bit more detail some of these resourcing options alongside the general strengths and challenges by the resource group. And so I wanted to just spend a little bit of time just digging a bit deeper into some of the options that you have internally within your organization. So specifically those GBS and COE options, as well as just the business or other risk and quality functions more broadly. So I thought I would start, maybe just kind of digging a bit deeper into this notion of self-service and how that can actually help you with work allocation. So all too often, I hear about self-service in the context of technology enablement, whether that's from the perspective of having a mechanism to push legal pre-approved content or advice to the business, or even just providing a window or a portal back in to legal in terms of the status of legal requests. But I think those technologies, those platforms, the self-service portals, I think they also present a real opportunity to actually reallocate work back to the business or to some other risk owner within the organization. And oftentimes that can really be your first line of defense into managing the work queues across your legal team members. And I guess just to, kind of consider things a bit more broadly in terms of setting aside like the methodology or the tools, if you will, to allocate the work. Just the notion of having a shared service hub or a COE of some kind, I really think presents some opportunity, to consider other resources to carry out some of the work and to unburden your legal teams. When we go into our client organizations and start to survey the landscape, we oftentimes just discover operational teams all over the place that people didn't know existed, and that really kind of presents some opportunities for legal to align work there. And maybe that's something that had not previously been considered in the past. And so, one of the trends that we're generally seeing is that legal is starting to look at some of these operational teams or delivery centers, if you will, and perhaps they were designed or deployed for some function other than legal, but now the question becomes, can legal tap into that and take advantage of some of those enterprise initiatives and investments that have been made? And can we start to identify some of these cross-functional synergies for processes like deal governance and vendor invoice review that are common across functions? So I guess in summary here, this is not only just a great way to solve for resourcing, but again, it helps you to, or legal, to help drive more ROI from some of those enterprise investments and initiatives that have been made. So we can move on. So really now, like after having reviewed this spectrum of legal work as well as resourcing options, I wanted to just preview with you all another framework that we commonly use to then like zoom in very specifically on the work that has been ring-fenced for your legal department. And so this particular framework is one that can support a very tactical workshop style exercise, as Heather had alluded to earlier, where a leadership team can sit together, align their schedules, and start to rationalize how work is distributed to their team, and in particular, matched to very specific resource profiles and experience levels that you have within the department. So this is a framework that can be like very easily tailored and populated with the very specific processes and work routines that your department manages. We casually refer to this as a above and below the line exercise. So if you look just across the different rows here, it's just a two-dimensional framework, right? And so what we have depicted here is strategic and non-strategic, or more or less strategic or higher complexity, lower complexity. You can play with the semantics, right? And kind of get it right, for your audience. But again, the idea is that you have an opportunity, specifically like if you have whiteboarding, digital whiteboarding technologies and things like that, it's a great tool to be able to, again, like sit together in one forum, physically move some of these activities around. And in the process, you don't realize like how effective that is to actually harmonize these different perspectives on the workload, right? Because all of these different, team leads and whatnot will probably have, very different thoughts and perspectives around what this could look like, just based on the resources that they currently have at their disposal, and who they have relationships with, like from a external vendor or firm perspective. So to summarize, I would just say that the end game, right, is really to begin to identify some of these win-win type opportunities where, number one, you have more senior resources that can find leverage, and you can finally get them out of the space between the rock and the hard place, right, where they just don't feel like they've gotten enough attention or alignment around, what needs to change and how it needs to change. But then in addition, we really see this as an opportunity for junior resources to identify some of these learning and growth opportunities by, being aligned to some of these work activities. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on a permanent basis, right? Like we have many clients that have experimented with work rotations for some of the more junior resources within the department. And that is very intentional as part of their growth and development strategy and their overall retention program for the department. So I'll pause there and maybe just kind of see if anyone has any questions, about that before I kind of go into some other examples of what might be effective for you in your role to help drive some of these conversations. Okay, I think we can go ahead and move forward. I think we're doing great on time and should have plenty of time at the end to open it up for Q&A broadly. So we'll move on to this slide here. And, again, before pivoting to more of these tools and enablers and frameworks, I wanted to just briefly touch on process, right? Heather laughs that this is sometimes the unsexy part of legal operations is to figure out how to actually improve the process, and sometimes even absent additional resources or fancy new tech, right? But it's just so critically important, as I'm sure you're all well aware, to look at the processes and determine what might require re-examination before determining who exactly should do the work, right? So if certain processes, for example, can be dramatically simplified or even automated, it can be a total game changer from a resourcing perspective, right? It could mean fewer people. It could mean a totally different profile of resource. And again, to Heather's point earlier, perhaps it's more of a technologist related task as opposed to attorney paralegal task. Now, that being said, process improvement isn't easy, right? And so just to tie my commentary back to what you're seeing, on the screen here, particularly on the right-hand side, you can see that the majority of the respondents in our recent 2021 UI Law survey, indicated that most of the legal departments, have indicated that they lack the skills to automate processes, right? Or 77% have indicated that they're continuously challenged to drive the adoption of new or changed processes. So, okay, so what does that really mean, right? Like, what do you do, and how do you start to think through all of these dependencies, all these what-if scenarios, and how do you start to tackle it in a somewhat sequential fashion so that you ultimately get to the right answer? So I will progress to the next slide, and what I can say, or really the best answer I think that I can offer to this group, is just to consider a holistic assessment of everything that we've talked about thus far. So kind of beginning with this notion in the center of really ring fencing or defining the work that you want your department to do. So we've used a term called a legal service catalog. And people use different terms for that, right? But it's really starting there and defining the services that you want to insource within your legal department. And then from there, starting to gain, and it can be superficial, but gaining some level of an understanding of the processes, the supporting technology, and the existing support teams and talent that you have that align to all of that work. And so what's critically important about that survey, if you will, of the current state, and kind of doing it very broad brush as opposed to just focusing in on one of those areas and trying to defer a process improvement discussion or trying to defer technology discussion, is that you'll be able to think through and potentially pre-clear a lot of questions or challenges that might come up when you're actually trying to make the case for more resources of some kind, or you're trying to sit down in those focus groups to think through how to potentially realign the work. So on the right-hand side, we've offered up just a few additional guiding principles for any kind of activity analysis that you may wish to undertake within your department. And that includes concepts such as, again, as I mentioned just a minute ago, but looking at process ownership, right? And looking at risk ownership, how to simplify those processes. But something else that I wanted to call out that I don't know that we've touched on too much just yet, and that is just making sure that you collect qualitative data from your legal teams with respect to process challenges and opportunities for improvement. There's only so much that the data can tell you, in that regard. And so we think it's critically important to just identify and develop those mechanisms to stay connected to the teams and to create those feedback loops so that your teams can tell you what's working well and what's not working well. And is this really a process issue, or is this really a resourcing issue, right? And if it's both, what's the right order in which to solve for it? And so, again, just with this remote work environment, this hybrid environment, just can't emphasize enough just the criticality of staying connected and finding a way to get that feedback. Okay, so I thought I would just, since we've talked about, surveying the landscape, collecting data, whether that's collecting data from your teams or collecting data from your systems, thought I would just step you through just a quick list of some of the common tools, methods, enablers that we use and that we've seen be successful in terms of gaining all this contextual information, that you need to really look at work allocation at a more granular level than the very big picture view that we started out with, right? And so, first and foremost, I would say, definitely determine what data you have in what systems, right, that can be retrieved and aggregated and can help to inform different members of your team with respect to work allocation. So that could be really anything from quantifying the amount of requests in Bob's queue versus Susan's queue. If you actually have a workflow tool, you might be able to measure turnaround time and actually make some informed decisions based on work allocation, whether it's to a resource pool or to an individual, to the extent that you can, that you're capturing that information and that you're able to easily pull it, compile it into a data report or a dashboard of some kind and push it out to select team members. The second item that we have listed here in terms of a data collection method is a scorecard. And you might be wondering, well, how is that any different than a dashboard? and I'll just kind of give you my perspective on it. I'm sure there's other perspectives out there amongst this team. But I really think about scorecards that are a bit more intentionally designed that can actually help you pull information versus push information from a system and pull it from your team leads, right? And one of the nice things about that scorecard is that you can design it in such a way, since someone will actually be facilitating the compilation, and it can have a mix of both quantitative data points and qualitative data points that are so important in providing relevant context for the workloads, right? So maybe you only are able to measure a very minimal amount, but it's better than nothing. So you include those metrics on the dashboard, but you're able to provide that overlay into why the data is what it is and what you're not seeing here, et cetera. And that can really be helpful in driving some of those conversations, specifically amongst a leadership team more broadly. The third item that we have listed is manager toolkits and team discussion guides. And these are just another great enabler to really empower whether or not it is a mid-level manager within your department, or some other kind of a representative, but really enabling them to have a consistent framework in which they can go out and have team discussions, and they can capture all of that qualitative feedback in a semi-structured format, again, to make it easier for an operations team, for a senior leadership team, et cetera, to really be able to look across and identify what are the themes, right? What are the anecdotes? What are the examples? What are we hearing? There's just a unique benefit in having something that helps to structure purely qualitative inputs, and that also compels people from your team to go have conversations, right? So that team lead might sit in a strategy meeting, but how do you know that they're actually then disseminating that information to your teams? And so then finally, some of the standard methods of surveys and workshops, again, is just a great way to reach a much broader cross-section of people within the department. And again, to get an idea of, what they're working on, what the bottlenecks are, what the process challenges are, any ideas that they have around process improvement and just general sentiment. And so that's also just a great method to create very compelling and unbiased insights, because it's raw, it's anonymous, and there's usually a lot of inputs, that you get back and are able to summarize and tell a very crisp story around. Okay, so those are all, again, to summarize, like methods in which you can get data that can help inform your work allocation strategy or help you identify where you might want to consider shifting, who supports which processes. And so I'm going to turn the presentation back to Heather here in a minute or two, but I thought I would just close out this section with two very specific examples of the output, right? Of once you have collected the data, talked about it, what can you actually create that can help you drive a strategic conversation of what specifically you want to change and what the impact of that change will be as it relates to either your resourcing strategy or the work allocation strategy. So what Heather has up here on the screen is just a purely objective and quantitative view of what a work activity analysis, could reveal, right? And it's very specific, down to certain resources, certain processes, and either how they're spending their time, or it could be flipped to activity targets and how you would like those team members to be spending their time based on their role. The particular example that we're showing here is actually benchmark data from the ACC. So if you did endeavor to create something highly quantitative like this in terms of how people are spending their time, you could actually compare your data to this and see what that tells you. But it might be hard to compile the data. The data might not exist. Or, what we hear a lot is that, this is just not really our management style, right? Like, we don't really want to go out and ask our teams to, via a survey or some other mechanism, to estimate, how they spend their time, or worse, actually require them to input their time into some kind of enterprise system that other functions use. So I'll just, quickly show you one other example. If you go to the next slide, of another approach that you could take to really get down to brass tacks in terms of how you might want to change the allocation of work. And so this approach would be to take your org charts or your operating model and start to overlay the results of the activity mapping exercise that we had previously walked through. And this will really just help you and your teams get focused on the what, the who, and the how as it relates to pushing work down, right? So that above the line, below the line concept, like pulled through and contextualized with the reality of your structure and your resources, and down to the specific contract types in this example, right? That would be handled by which resource profile or which team. And so, this is something that you can replicate for different teams, different processes, but this is really where a lot of it comes together in terms of figuring out what changes are we actually going to make and what might be required from a change management perspective as it relates to the realignment of work from one team or resource group to another. And finally, I'll just add that another great benefit of kind of creating a framework like this is that, it helps you to really identify where you have missing roles or where you don't have enough resources for what you're trying to achieve. And so basically having empty boxes on a chart like this and TBD and whatnot can oftentimes be that very first step in helping you identify where you need to develop a business case for more internal hires, because you have this vision, you have this plan, but you simply just don't have anyone that can play a certain role, at this point in time. So with that, I am going to turn it back to Heather. I think we just have one or two more concepts to cover, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Thanks, Karen. And I think there was a question that came into the chat from Frank around data and decision making. Frank, I think the next couple slides might address that a bit. If not, we can dive in more in the Q&A. So we wanted to provide an illustrative example of tech enablement of a number of these themes that we have been talking about, and how you can kind of operationalize really some of these. Some of the tools and outcomes and conclusions that you may draw through some of those preceding accelerators that Karen was talking through. One note, I think, on where the industry really is on this front in terms of what you're looking at on this slide is that most companies, I think north of 80%, have implemented tech enablement for basic legal workflows. Approval to sign is a good example, but only about 35% have gotten to the point where they have implemented more sophisticated technology enablement around legal intake, workflow, and matter management. And I raise that point because it's possible the number of you on the call today are looking specifically at this. You may be evaluating your capabilities, maybe building business cases for investment in this area, or potentially refining or optimizing technology that you perhaps have already invested in. And so if you haven't done it yet, you're not alone. We want to make that point. If you've done it successfully, everyone probably will want to hear from you. So don't be shy. And one other point on from an integration standpoint, we could have a whole session just on the tech, right? And there are platforms in the market that do all three of these things: the legal intake and the matter management and dashboarding and so forth. But it's not unusual for us to work with clients who have one or two of these things and are looking at augmenting them. So it doesn't mean you need to scrap what you've done and go for the end-to-end. We just want to make the point that's really important, that if you bring in other systems to ensure that there's interoperability between those systems in the key areas, so that you can actually drive the reporting that you need ultimately to really gain some insight into the work and to drive informed decision making. So one example that we hear a lot and we see a lot is that it is literally life-changing for the legal department to have a capability that allows the business to see where their matters are, like where they stand. And so from that standpoint, you would want to ensure that you have built into your intake template the requester, right, the business unit, important information like that, so that it's going to drive into those reports or dashboards that are being used by other stakeholders. Karen was telling me she actually just had a conversation with a client who recently implemented legal intake to feed into their dashboarding, and an almost immediate impact was that the business began to reprioritize their deals on their own, because when the management could see that every single deal was marked as high priority, they know that's not the case, and they were able to go in to make some real-time updates to help the legal department make resourcing decisions about how to accelerate those to close. So, and that's just sort of the tip of the spear, really, in terms of how the information captured in these platforms can be used. You can see on the right, we've got some examples of kinds of matter data that you may capture that will allow you to see things like the volume and trends over time and how long it typically takes to get certain kinds of matters done. There's just so much more you can do if you've got reliable and robust structured data around what is coming into the department. As Karen mentioned earlier, legal intake can really, it's your first line of defense. That is an area where you'll be able to see over time how many things are coming into the department that you've decided, potentially based on your previous exercises around your service catalog and what's above and below the line. Like, are there things that really the legal department shouldn't be doing? Are there opportunities to reroute those back to the business? Or, because I think it's difficult, we talk with clients a lot about this, it can be difficult for legal departments who view themselves as service providers and have to say no. But you can get data over time that will kind of help you tell that story in your interactions with the business about how the work is going to be triaged. We also want to note that you'll need to find the right balance of information that you want to build into your intake mechanism and into those forms that will enable auto routing of work to the resources that you have decided to map to certain types of work streams. We've seen instances where you sometimes have lawyers who are spending upwards of 25% of their time sort of playing that air traffic control role in terms of trying to weed out, figure out what should go to who, or to weed out those lower complexity work or things that really the department shouldn't be doing. So there's nothing prescriptive we would lay out, just that that's going to be a balance that every department is going to have to look at when you're looking particularly at the auto routing. And so from a data capture, dashboarding and reporting standpoint, I think some of these examples we have for matter data can be very powerful in terms of equipping leadership of the department to tell the value story about what the department is doing. The business is often just not really aware of everything that the legal department is doing. You'll be able to see how many escalations they're handling, deals. I think one of the more quantifiable metrics, sort of Frank's question, if you can point to revenue that the department is helping to drive through deal escalations that are coming into legal and getting those across the line. From a capacity planning standpoint, you're making a business case for headcount or justifying who you have. If you know that the sales team is going to be ramping up 25%, you've got flat resources, you've got data where you know how long it takes you typically to handle a deal or how many lawyers it's going to take to drive X number of dollars of revenue. You've got your business case for additional resources. And you'll be able to see over time as well. It will help, I think, also with just that reallocation, right, of seeing where the work is going, whether those are the right resources, where are there opportunities to push more routine work down to the mid-level. Maybe you don't need lawyers handling all of that work. Maybe you need more paralegals. Maybe you need more technologists or contract negotiators. These are the kinds of data points that will allow you to get a little more insight and make those kinds of resourcing decisions going forward. And then I'm just conscious of time. We've got two more. I'm going to make a quick point here, and then one note on change management. This is some examples of metrics and measurements that you can try to obtain to inform your work allocation practices and ongoing calibration. There's lots of ways to build dashboards and scorecards. There have been excellent sessions, I think, both within legal operators and CLOC and other forums around the topic of what data, how to tell a story with data and legal. But just at a very high level, I encourage everyone to be really conscious of who is the audience going to be for the reports, for the findings that you're going to present. What can you measure? How much effort is going to be required, right? To what's actually practical and feasible for you to get? How much effort is going to be required? If it can be relied upon. And then what do your stakeholders want to do with it, right? So if you know that you have a leader who feels under-resourced and wants to make a a case for additional headcount, that is going to inform which of these areas you really lean into in terms of gathering that data, the data together. So it's really more about substance than form. There's lots of dashboarding capabilities that are built into various tools, and obviously you can invest lots of time and energy into building data lakes and so forth, depending on your department size. But we just really want to underscore that this is really consider your audience and what those stakeholders are going to want to do with the kinds of data that you're giving them. And then one quick note on change management, also a topic that deserves its own presentation. How many of us have seen excellent initiatives or ideas or a lot of work that's been put in kind of falter or fail to be as impactful as it could because of a lack of strong change management support or communications internally within the department? So again, here we'll share the slides with folks, but I think the key points are to really be engaged with the department and people, gather input, and really can feel like they are very involved in an agency over these types of change and these transformation initiatives, working groups. You cannot really over communicate in these instances. And I would also add, we hear a lot, is it's important. Did you guys lose me there for a minute, or are we good, Karen? We're good. Okay.
It was brief, but I don't know that we really missed any key messages, so you're good.
Okay, thank you. It was spinning there for a little while. I was a little bit concerned. And so my last point here is also to prioritize your initiatives. Like, don't hit people with too much change all at once. Pick something that you have a high degree of confidence that people will respond well to, or have been quite clear in their articulation is something that they really, really want. Execute well on it, show success, make refinements, and then move on to your next priority. So with that, we've got about 6 minutes left. We've covered a lot of ground. As Karen and I were putting this together, we thought, some of these slides deserve their own workshops. If the audience may have questions or experiences they'd like to share, so we'd really just like to open the floor essentially through chat. This doesn't have to be super heavy data driven, but anything anecdotal, best practices, or any challenges that anyone in the audience is really having, where they'd like to get some input from the group.
Heather, Karen, we'll wait for see if any questions come in, but there's a lot to digest. That's just a fantastic presentation. And as you said, like with slides like change management, you could do your own topic on, and maybe we can come back and do a series on this stuff because it's a lot of insights. Just a quick question from my perspective. Like there's a lot of movement in legal operations and people are taking new teams. What should the mindset of someone in legal operations moving into a new role, evaluating all this stuff? How could they possibly use somebody like EY, right, to kind of help them think about a strategy, right? What would the steps be to look at, like outside counsel management, whether diversity programs, whether it's new tech stacks, intake triage systems? Is there a checklist that should be running through, like building out a technology roadmap? Or
well, I think, I'll offer a thought, and then I want to give the floor to Karen. I think moving into a new role and new company, as always, I think it's one of the most important things you can do out of the gate is really to start to get to know your stakeholders. I always like to start with just really understanding, where is the business? Where are there known pain points? Like GC told me once, she's like, when I first start, like, look for the low hanging fruit. Like where are the things that are causing pain now that you could get some sort of quick wins. But I think first, obviously, getting to know, really informing yourself about the context in which you're operating, and kind of getting an initial lay of the land, and then beginning to kind of frame that picture out. But Karen, please offer your perspective here.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, you don't necessarily need to go big with surveys and high level group engagement, if you will, right? Like there's a way to wade in and get to know people, right? And so I think that even just taking that manager toolkit concept and modifying it a bit to be a discussion framework for just one-on-one conversations with team leaders, right? But again, I think the structure helps. It's not so much the format of it, right? But just going to different individuals and asking them a very consistent and similar set of questions, it will inevitably, yield some interesting insights and perspectives where you feel like, okay, this seems to be a trend or a common concern, right? Or we've got 3 people raising the same issue. So I would just kind of, recommend, starting there and some of those one-on-one conversations. And then, also just seeing, who else you can get aligned to the legal operations agenda, right? Maybe not formally aligned as a sub-function, but, having someone that is an advocate in that regard and can help you be like a sounding board, somebody that's been within the department for more time, for example, would be like another just a great way to kind of start and to figure out what's been done before, what's worked well, what hasn't, what do you think is the best method of engagement, for the department. And then just kind of go from there, right? And start to then, tap into some of those other tools and methods that we talked about.
Perfect.
Karen, we had another question come in here from Randall around recommendation for best CLM software for mid-sized legal departments. I think, Karen, this is one where we hear a lot, right? At EY, we get, what technology platform do you recognize? This is often a starting point, actually, for conversations. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would want to, maybe we could take it offline and we could like talk about, specific tools. And we do have some perspectives in terms of how we would categorize a lot of the CLM software, right? And it's more about the feature set and if the tool is functionally focused, versus if it's a more broad in its design, right, as opposed to kind of the size of the organization that it might be best suited for. But yes, there's definitely, we have a perspective on different categories of tools, and I mean, that might be something we could take offline. The Gartner reports, the Forrester reports, all of those are actually like just great resources as well to get tool-specific insights.
I'm going to jump in here, and I'm not going to be biased on anybody because I lived in this space for over a decade. I'd say on the mid-sized firms, a really, really hot one right now is Malbec, right? There's Parley Pro is another one. You've got Ironclad, you got Contract Pod AI, you got Concord, all in the mid tier. If they have a Salesforce play, I would look at those as well, but you'd be looking at more enterprise solutions like the Congas, Icertis, the Aptus, and then entry level solutions more like the Contract Works. But that's just my opinion, Randall. Hope that kind of helps. But I would check them all out. I do an RFI and an RFP. With that, I think we're at the top of the hour.
We are.
I want to thank everybody for attending today. Heather, Karen, this is one of the best presentations I've did in the past year and a half of this. It's fantastic. Very, very insightful. I look forward to sharing to an even broader audience. For the folks in attendance today, we will be following up with the slide deck and the video. I'll be making Karen and Heather's information available if you have any follow-up questions, because there's a lot to drill down on and so much information. Thank you both very much. Really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.